Good evening, everybody, and welcome. My name is Michael Gilmartin, and I'm currently serving as the president of the Lackawanna Historical Society, and I am here this evening pitching in for Sandra Myers, who asked me if I could do her a favor since she had a conflict, and I'm happy to oblige her. Embattled Freedom is the subject tonight, and it is a great book. You are going to be, I think, thoroughly intrigued by the presentation, and if you're not familiar with the book and you live here, you should read this. It's a wonderful story, and it has great documentation and facts and visualization. It's really an interesting read. Jim Remsen is a journalist and the author of two prior books, The Intermarriage Handbook and Visions of Tioga. Since retiring as religion editor at the Philadelphia Inquirer, he has pursued a keen interest in history with a focus on often underappreciated yet very revealing aspects of local history. Being a native of Waverly, PA, his third book, Embattled Freedom, brings a defining period of his hometown's history to light. In learning about Waverly's runaway slaves and their white allies, Jim came to see how much animosity they faced on the home front, particularly as the Civil War bore down on them. In his book, the subject of tonight's program, as I stated, Jim shares with us a vivid depiction of life in rural northeastern Pennsylvania in the 1800s, and further details the stories of 13 of Waverly's black fathers and sons during a tumultuous time. After the presentation, I hope you will join us at the Historical Society headquarters, the Catlin House, for a reception. And now it is my pleasure to introduce Jim Remsen.
Thank you so much, Michael. It's really a privilege and an honor to be here. I'm really excited to have this opportunity. And I want to thank the Historical Society, the Schemmel Forum, Sherman Wooden, and Cindy Wooden of the Center for Anti-Slavery Studies in Montrose that has collaborated on this. And I want to thank my wife for being a support in all this, Sally and Peter Bolin, who supported this work, and the Willery Foundation that provided me a generous grant to be able to complete certain aspects of this project. So I come to you tonight as a member of the great northeastern Pennsylvania diaspora. I was raised here, and like a lot of others, we trickled away, went and drifted off in the wind in all four directions. I ended up in Philadelphia, but left some of myself up here, and I'm always delighted to come back up and reconnect with friends and just reconnect with my roots. So it really is great to be up here. I also come to you as a bit of a wild card. I wrote a history book, but I'm not really a credentialed historian. I wrote a book about Waverly, but I'm not a resident of Waverly, and I wrote a book that looks at the black experience, and I'm not a black man, and I have no black ancestry as best I know. But my stake in writing this, I felt like my standing in being able to write this is that I'm from Waverly, and I felt like there's information that I wanted to try to impart about our past. So I grew up during the baby boom era. Waverly was a great place to grow up. I played out in the woods and in the swamps and biked around, and it was a period of the centennial of the Civil War. My dad was a history buff, and I got kind of hooked on history as a result and on Civil War history. Then went off to college, got into journalism, spent most of my career at the Philly Inquirer. One of my colleagues, by the way, was Trudy Rubin, who I understand was here a couple of weeks ago, and I hope gave you a real informative presentation. She was a very respected and valued colleague. I remember having conversations with her as we consulted on certain stories. I took a buyout from the paper 12 years ago now to go off and do some other things, but an important part of that is I treated myself to a road trip around Pennsylvania. And coming out of that was my tuning into the American Indian history in Pennsylvania, particularly on the Susquehanna River Valley. Traveling up there got me seeing anew, as we often do as we get older. You know, as kids we might not have cared that much. I would stop and read all the markers and just felt kind of cheated, like why didn't we get taught this in school? Not only the Sullivan expedition, but the Indian perspective on it all. And coming out of that was a book that I researched and wrote called Visions of Tioga. Tioga is a spot on the upper Susquehanna River that was very important in history, and it was just fallen into obscurity for no good reason. So I wrote that very much with kids, with school kids in mind. It brought in some characters of that age just to make them, relate to it a little more, but then in the process teach them about this history, and hopefully up here getting them to realize that they were not only on the sidelines of history up here. This was very much caught up in the tumultuous history of our early colonial and national era. So that was satisfying to write. Got it into some schools and I think raised some awareness. Then thought, well, what would be another project? And that's when Waverly started kind of speaking to me again. Growing up, we were dimly aware as kids about the Underground Railroad past of Waverly. We knew where the houses were, where the colored people used to live. By the time I was a kid, it was all gone. The black church had closed in the 1920s, and the last of the original families had moved away. But we knew a little about it, and I wanted to dig in a little bit more. So that became my next project, because I felt it was sorely undertaught in history, and to kids and to all of us. So I dove in. And this became the base of my research. This is what is now lovely Waverly, but back then was a muddy village. This is a photo of the main street in probably the 1890s, maybe the 1880s. Waverly was a village of about 300 people. It was a hub of commercial activity. It was where, for the region, it was the founding settlement of what was Abington Township, an enormous mother township that other townships split off from as time went on and the population grew. But originally it was Abington Township. Waverly was called Abington Center. And it was where the supply stores were, where the churches were, where the post office was. There was a town school there as well. And it was lily white until the era that I'll be talking about. It was settled by New England Yankees, by and large, coming from Rhode Island and Connecticut. Over time, some also coming down from New York as well. And some of them were abolitionists, meaning wanted to abolish slavery. And when the fugitives came through, fugitive slaves escaping from the South, they were helped on their way through. And as time went on, the support was such that some of the fugitives decided to actually stay, which was a remarkable occurrence. This is an old Underground Railroad map from a book that came out in 1900. And we all know our geography. I hope well enough to know that right up there in northeastern PA, we've got Wilkes-Barre, we've got Montrose, and there's little Waverly as one of the established stops. Just to give you an idea that this was known as a way station. Most of the fugitives who remained in Waverly, by the way, came from western Maryland, down south of Gettysburg. We're talking Hagerstown, Frederick, and would have come over to Harrisburg. And by and large, I mean, there were different stories, but I was finding a general flow would be to Harrisburg, north up the river, Wilkes-Barre, and then overland to Waverly, and then maybe north to Montrose if they didn't stay in Waverly. By the time, this settlement began in the 1840s, and by right around Civil War time, it grew to its peak of about 70 people in Waverly and environs, black people. This is the fugitives, and then they would raise their families too. I learned about the fact that there were, when the Civil War came, some of them who went off and enlisted in the Union Army and fought, went back down south into danger and fought. It would be a line in some of the old histories, but no detail, no particular interest in it, and I thought that it was remarkable that they had put themselves through that bravely and gone back down south, and why wasn't more known about it? So I made that part of my goal, to learn what I could about that, and to look at the black experience of not only who were us white heroes who protected and nurtured them, which was sticking their necks out a bit, but who were these fugitives who came up, and by and large, how were they treated up north? Yes, there were friends. Was that the norm, or was it not the norm? So I decided to make it be a social history, to put their lives in context. And I used the lives of the 13 soldiers as a framework for the book. So it basically covers their lifetimes, from the birth of the first of the 13 soldiers to the death of the last of the 13 soldiers, which covers about 1820s, 1830, up to mid-1920s, when the last of these 13 men died. So that became a good narrative framework, you might say. I jumped in and just some of the research highlights were looking at county histories, town histories, church histories, census and land records, military and pension papers, diaries, folk histories, newspapers, period newspapers, very important, and a lot of modern scholarship. I did a lot of reading and cited and footnoted the work of modern scholars. Always looking at what to make of Waverly. Was it a model community? Was this outside the norm, or was this a welcoming area? And the answer was, at least for Waverly, a qualified yes. Nothing is always as simple as you want it to be. I would have been happy to have Waverly be a lovely model community, being where I'm from, but it was a yes, but. It's a complicated story, and I want to walk you through some of that. I want to focus for a few minutes on a foundational story that we don't know about up here, and we really should. I was shocked to learn about it, and it was very influential nationally. It involved a legal case of a man named William Fogg. And this is before the 1840s, when the first of the fugitives stayed in Waverly. This is a lovely pastoral scene in Scott Township, just off Route 81. This is the barn where William Fogg originally built his barn. It may have been expanded on over the years, but this was his property. He had come from Connecticut, New London, Connecticut, 1811, with his family. When settlers were coming over here, the land had been staked out and warranted and surveyed and warranted and was available. And his stepdad bought the land and brought his family over. William Fogg, came as a boy. As he grew into adulthood, he became what we call a yeoman farmer. They actually cleared the land. I can't imagine, I wouldn't have been a good settler. They had to do everything. They had to knock down the trees, clear the land, remove the rocks, build the house, or whatever they lived in at first, the cabin, build the barn, sink the well, get in the crops, take care of their families. And they were able to scuffle that out, and he became a landowner. He paid his taxes, was a family man, raised a family there. But there was one thing different about him. He was a person of color. He was the only person of color in Scott Township. It originally was Abington Township, then it became Greenfield Township. Now it's part of Scott Township. By the way, as you learn more about him, you might want to go here. It's on a little country lane called Joe Lick Road. Your GPS will get you there, Lick, L-I-C-K. He's a man who lived more recently, and the road was named for him. I've been to there and to the current owners. They didn't know anything about their predecessors' name or history, which is the way it is with all of us. But so the Foggs came. They were people of color. They were free blacks. They were not born into slavery. They were not escaping, although blacks in Connecticut at that period were at the bottom of the barrel, you might say, could not vote, were disdained. One right they had was they could own land, they could own property. So they were able to buy this property sight unseen and make their way here to seek a new start. And then William Fogg comes in 1830s, it takes a bold move that thrusts him into history. And I have a whole chapter in the book that resurrects his story and the importance of his story for us. Because the 1830s was the age of Andrew Jackson and Jacksonian Democracy. He was elected in 28, was in power till 37. 36, 37. There's Old Hickory on the left, that kind of irascible Indian fighter who also, you may not know, was a Southern slaveholder. And he was the leader of this movement that would be called Jacksonian Democracy. They called their party the Democracy. It wasn't, the Democrats. It was the Democracy. You would see it referred to that way in the old accounts. And they extolled the common man, you might say, the yeoman, not the elites. They battled the banks, market controls, centralized power. We think of it as a populist movement today. They also had another aspect of their ideology, which was white power, white supremacy, the White Republic. It was actually called the White Republic. And they were avowing it more and more, particularly as abolitionism was raising its voice in the 1830s as well. And they were mortal enemies of abolition and abolitionists. And the Pennsylvania Democrats, the Democracy, was considered the South's most reliable ally. In other words, they would stand with the South, with the slaveocracy, it was called, the slave owners in the South. And Luzerne County, which this was then Luzerne County, Lackawanna didn't form until 1878, was considered a bulwark, a hotbed of Jacksonian democracy. And paradoxically, so was Waverly. Good little Waverly, which would nurture the slaves, also was majority Democrats. You can see it in all the election results, and some of the leading citizens were outspoken Democrats. One of the great paradoxes in the book that I can talk a little bit more about later. Now, one of the reasons you might oppose abolition back then is your worry that if pushed too hard, the South would bolt and it would break the Union apart. Okay, it could, but it was a moral question. Do you want to stand with the evil slave holders? And a lot of the folks who were willing even would admit it was an evil system that got foisted on the colonies by England, and it got embedded, and we wished it wasn't there, but we didn't think it was worth breaking the Union apart over. Others, like the abolitionists, said, no way, this is a repugnant and we have to stop it. A lot of fighting in the country about that, political fighting over that. But there was also just raw racism behind a lot of the opposition to abolitionism and to black rights back then. There was this idea that we'll start to you'll hear more and more, and it will be probably familiar to you, of a ranking of the races. But the Anglo-Saxons were at the top, and then you'd have Irish below them and the Italians below them. So it wasn't really just white. It was this weird sense of all these substrata. And of course, the Anglo-Saxons were at the top. The savage Indians, savages in quotes of theirs, would be way down low on the scales of civilization, they would say, and blacks would be the degraded bottom. And that was taking force in the country, and certainly something that the Democrats would accept. In the 1830s, there also became paranoia over black uprisings, slave uprisings. There was this large Nat Turner rebellion in which 60 white people were actually killed by escaped slaves that was brutally then put down. But there was a fear that that would spread to the north. There was a worry about jobs. There was sort of a paranoia that blacks would come and take away the jobs of other immigrants who were coming in, and there was a lot of resentment and hostility. So 1830s got really ugly. There was mob violence. There was a lot of what was called Negrophobia. There was a riot in Columbia, PA, if you know the state. It's south of Harrisburg on the Susquehanna River, where whites just torched a lot of black. It was a prosperous, I should say, black community. Whites were descending on them and burning, and there were deaths as well. And in 1833, there even was an attempt to have a law called the Act to Prohibit the Migration of Negroes and Mulattoes into the Commonwealth, put forward in Harrisburg. So just to give you an idea of the atmosphere. So 1835 comes, and this gets us back to William Fogg. The Democrats' grip on power was at risk of slipping. There was infighting among the Democrats. There also was some coalition building by the opposition, the Whigs and the anti-Masons at the time. And so a strong anti-Mason gubernatorial candidate was put forward, a man named Joseph Ritner, who was also an abolitionist. And denounced by the democracy as his black majesty. The Democrats were worried about a political setback. And so one of their steps they took was to police the polls, police the voting places. And it might have looked like this. I hope you all can see the images well enough. This is a painting from the period by George Caleb Bingham called The County Election. You would have to go and openly give your ballot. Often it would be through a window, and people would know, often by the color or the look of the ballot, who you were voting for. So William Fogg had to go through a scene like that to go and try to cast his vote. And he went to the polling place in Greenfield. Again, it's now the part that is in Scott. And he was summarily turned away. And he was turned away because of his race, because he wasn't white. Now, Pennsylvania had a 1790 Constitution that was race neutral. It just did not address race as one of the criteria for voting. So technically, they could try to claim voting rights and vote, and black people could. It was happening here and there, but often they were feeling intimidated or apathetic almost. I was reading about that being a feeling. This is a white man's game, and they just did not step forward to try to vote. William Fogg did on that day, and he probably did on other days as well. And when he was turned away, he filed suit. He actually got his back up, and he took the bold step of filing a civil suit against the County Board of Elections, accusing them of, quote, fraudulently and maliciously intending to injure and damnify him, end quote. Well, the board wasn't taking that sitting down, so they punched back and said, no, a free, quote, a free Negro or mulatto is not a citizen within the meaning of the law of the Constitution and the laws of the United States and the state of Pennsylvania, therefore not entitled to the right of suffrage, end quote. So Fogg's lawyers and advocates put together their case. They cited empowering language in the Articles of Confederation, the Federal Articles of Confederation. That quote is the free inhabitants of each of these states, paupers and vagabonds and fugitives from justice excepted, not them, but other free inhabitants shall be entitled to all privileges and immunities of free citizens in the several states, end quote. And they said that meant that free blacks of good standing like Fogg were entitled to vote by federal privilege in state elections. So the two sides, dug in, and the case came before the county court. The county judge at that time is David Scott, the namesake of Scott Township. He's in a mosaic in the rotunda of the Luzerne County Courthouse. You can see him and some of the other illustrious men of the time there. And he actually had a sympathetic stance toward Fogg. I found that he actually was the in-law of both of Fogg's lawyers, which wouldn't be exactly allowed today. One of those in-laws was an abolitionist, a fellow named Luther Kidder. I found an earlier resolution that he was a co-signer of in favor of abolitionism. So he might have been, favorably disposed already. So David Scott instructed the jury to bring a verdict for Fogg, and he held the election board liable for damages. He wrote, "We know of no such expression in the Constitution or laws of the United States, nor in the Constitution or laws of the state of Pennsylvania, which can legally be construed to prohibit free Negroes and mulattoes who are otherwise qualified from exercising the rights of an elector. The preamble to the Act for the Gradual Abolition of Slavery that was passed in Pennsylvania in 1780 breathes a spirit of piety and patriotism and fully indicates an intention in the legislature to make the man of color a free man." So David Scott was saying to William Fogg, "You're good to go. Yes, you can vote." And again, this is right here, folks. If this sounds sort of technical and legalistic, this was right here. This is a major case about black people's rights to do basic things like vote. And it was a seminal case, and it came to a head right here in our backyard. So the county appealed, and at that point, things went right up to the state Supreme Court. And the Chief Justice at the time was John Gibson, who also is enshrined in the pantheon of the Luzerne County Courthouse. He was from Luzerne at the time, and he's the namesake of Gibson, PA. If you head up 81, you will see a stop for Gibson. That is named for the great John Bannister Gibson. So the arguments were put before the court in the summer of 1837. And Gibson waited 7 months. He wrote the decision. He waited 7 months, and then boom, he came down with his ruling, which was emphatic. He said, "No colored race was party to our social compact. Our ancestors settled the province as a community of white men, and the blacks were introduced to it as a race of slaves, whence an unconquerable prejudice of caste, which has come down to our day, inasmuch that a suspicion of taint still has the unjust effect of sinking the subject of it, the black man, below the common level. Consistent with this prejudice, is it to be credited that parity of rank would be allowed to such a race? Let the question be answered by the statute of 1726. That was adopted in 1726. That was actually called an Act for the Better Regulating of Negroes in the Commonwealth. And that statute denominated it, indicated all blacks, even free blacks, are an idle and slothful people. All blacks, yeoman farmers, educated, whoever, by definition, idle and slothful people. This is our state Chief Justice. In interpreting the U.S. Constitution in the spirit of our own institutions, we are bound to pronounce that men of color are destitute of title to the elective franchise, end quote. So Gibson was saying that Article 4 of the U.S. Constitution quote, presents an obstacle to the political freedom of the Negro, end quote, by specifying that a class of people held in bondage in one part of the Confederacy should not be treated as citizens in another part. In addition, he cited what he said was a prior rejection of black suffrage by another earlier court in Pennsylvania called the High Court of Errors and Appeals in the mid-1790s. He said that it had rejected black suffrage, and he relied on his father's perfect recollection of that case, even though nobody could ever find a record of that case and that decision. But it was good enough for John Bannister Gibson. So with a stroke of the pen, he set out this doctrine that denied blacks voting rights, and it held in Pennsylvania for 33 years. It was not over until the adoption of the 15th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution that granted blacks the right to vote. So from 1837 to 1870, no black person could vote in Pennsylvania thanks to this case that originated right here. And there were repercussions from this case that were felt across America, across antebellum America. I quote a legal scholar in the book who said in the following years, quote, nearly every state court that ruled on black citizenship concluded that free persons of color were neither state nor American citizens. 4 attorney generals of the United States rejected black citizenship. Their view was endorsed by the leading Northern treatise on jurisprudence at the time and by Chief Justice John Marshall. And most significantly, our Fogg opinion served as a precedent for the notorious Dred Scott decision of 1857 that led us closer to the Civil War. So this was a federal case that came before the U.S. Supreme Court, and the Chief Justice, man may ring a bell from your school days, Roger Taney. He wrote that the Constitution's framers intended that people of African ancestry, slave or free, quote, had no rights which the white man was bound to respect, and that the Negro might justly and lawfully be reduced to slavery for his benefit, end quote. Taney himself being a slaveholder from Maryland. In comments afterward, Taney said Gibson's Fogg ruling was an important marker for him due to, quote, the just weight and authority of the court by which the opinion was given, end quote, and because, quote, it maintains precisely the same principles that his own Dred Scott decision advanced. I don't know if you knew any of this. I didn't. It was appalling to learn it. I'm sorry, I'm not being a dry academic historian. I find it appalling. Maybe we could talk about that if you don't. But our Fogg case was seminal in this national debate, this national discussion. So that is one track that was going on that had a lot of local content that led to the rollback of black rights up here, black voting rights in Pennsylvania. The other one going on concurrently was a constitutional reform convention in Pennsylvania that was happening in 1837 and 38, going on again simultaneous with the with Gibson's hearing and considering of this case. So as I said, he waited 7 months to issue his Fogg ruling, and it might be because he was waiting to kind of coordinate it with the outcome of the constitutional convention that was going on. Now, this convention was bringing up a package of amendments to the possible amendments to the Constitution. Some were unrelated. They were about executive power, judicial tenure, about chartering of banks and corporations, but also about suffrage and about black voting rights, very explicitly. And guess what? Our Luzerne County delegates loudly opposed black suffrage. It's in the record. I was able to go to the Historical Society of Pennsylvania and read through the proceedings of those debates and those floor discussions at the Constitutional Convention. So one of our fellows up here, a man from Wilkes-Barre named Ebenezer Warren Sturdivant, one of our Luzerne delegates, dismissed that colorblind suffrage clause from 1790 that I mentioned before as an oversight, saying that its framers, quote, unquestionably regarded black people as a degraded race, and therefore they took no notice of them. Esteeming them neither citizens nor freemen, they left them where they had found them, in the enjoyment of no political rights. I call upon delegates on this floor to pause before they yield a right to the Negro, which by an attempt to elevate him will degrade us. End quote. And where did he go? Oh, this is Tawney. I'm sorry, I didn't show you. This is a lovely fellow, Roger Tawney, and the core of his ruling. This lovely gentleman is G.W. Woodward, George Washington Woodward, also from Luzerne County, and another delegate who went on to be on the state Supreme Court here. He said, quote, "At no stage in our history have our people been willing to give them, black people, this right to vote. Now let us not offend against nature and do violence to the general feeling, the general public feeling, by saying in all time to come that they shall possess it, this right." Another Luzerne delegate, meanwhile, stepped forward and offered a resolution that just flatly restricted the vote to, quote, "every white male citizen who otherwise met the age and residency and property requirements." And this other Luzerne delegate was a man named Andrew Bedford, who's from my little Waverly, PA. He's the one who built that lovely home across from the community house, if you can picture it. It looks like a plantation house. That was Andrew Bedford, a businessman, doctor, illustrious citizen of Waverly, and made that a ultimately successful demand to roll back black voting rights in the U.S. Constitution, to make it just clear. Didn't know that either. And I wonder if he had Fogg in mind. He did not ever say anything that was recorded in the proceedings. I could not find him saying anything in the newspapers as well. But Fogg was right in his neck of the woods, and perhaps he was wanting to make a statement to Fogg and felt like he somehow represented that neighborhood. So this resolution was passed by the delegates, 77 to 45, and it went before the electorate. And before it went up to a vote, but after the vote by the delegates, before it went up to the public, and it was voted on by the delegates, then Gibson came down with his Fogg ruling, making, according to another scholar who I quote in there, making, quote, "the creation of the White Republic of Pennsylvania more complete by stamping the seal of the Pennsylvania Supreme Court upon it." So there were these two tracks happening simultaneously. Now, there was a black appeal, blacks in Philadelphia primarily assembled, and they were frightened, as you can imagine, by where this was leading. They issued an appeal. It really was a plea. It's called an appeal of 40,000 citizens. That would be people of color, threatened with disfranchisement, an appeal to the people of Pennsylvania in 1838. And they said, among their pleas was, "reject, fellow citizens, the partial disenfranchising constitution offered you by the Reform Convention, the Constitutional Convention, and we shall confidently expect that the Supreme Court will also do us the justice itself and honor and retract its decision," meaning the Fogg decision. "Should it not, our appeal will still be open to the conscience and common sense of the people, of you, the people," end quote. Well, they got pushback from the delegates, the white delegates. Bedford and his four fellow delegates from our region issued a caustic reply to this black appeal. In a statement that ran in two leading newspapers, they called on citizens in Luzerne, Monroe, Wayne, and Pike counties to ratify the whites-only amendment because, quote, "the government was made by white men and it must be preserved by white men," end quote. "Black people are, quote, a caste, and to confer suffrage on them would be political amalgamation," mixing. They declared, quote, "Against amalgamation in all its monstrous and hideous aspects, the instincts of nature rebel. Whether it be social or political, amalgamation, is alike opposed to all the indications of the divine will and all the sensibilities of human nature," end quote. So this feels like hate speech. I don't enjoy reading this stuff. I mean, it pains me and perhaps pains you to hear it. But this is not being said by crackpots. This is being said by our elected officials and our appointed officials representing the public. And they were, basically proclaiming white supremacy and exclusive white entitlement. So the constitutional amendments were approved by the Pennsylvania voters, the electorate, somewhat narrowly, but they were approved. And as I said, black men were stripped of the vote for the next 33 years. Black men, ladies, sorry, but your turn came the next century. But black men were stripped of the vote until the 15th Amendment. And again, the Luzerne men were behind this move, and they all went on to distinguished careers. It may not have been because they did this, but by the same token, this was not a stain on their career. It was almost like people shrugged, what do you expect? They went on to congressmen, county district attorneys, state Supreme Court. I chronicle all that in the book. You can read the details there. And back in Abington Center, back in Waverly, that summer, July 4th, Andrew Bedford was toasted for his great work on the Constitutional Convention work. It's in the old newspapers. And so remember our William Fogg. Well, whatever happened to him? He sure got his nose bloodied in by sticking up for his rights. Well, he farmed, went back to his farm and farmed until his death in the 1880s. But he did live to see the 15th Amendment adopted in 1870, and he lived to see the Pennsylvania Constitution finally changed in 1873 to eliminate white as a voting requirement. And here's his headstone. I was able to track it down. It's right off Route 81 at the Scott exit. Again, there's a little county graveyard called the Carpenter Cemetery. And if you go in, and he's right on the right side, not far up at all. It's only got maybe 50 graves in it. And it looks odd because this is a funny story. I had a friend go, and I had tried to kind of gently scrape to make sure I could read the years and such. This friend, an old comet from Abington like me, who lives up at Baylor's Lake in Fleetville, he took a shaving cream and a scraper, just a plastic scraper, and was able to scrape across the surface. That's why it looks so kind of odd. We were able to read everything, including the tiny little cursive epitaph at the bottom, which I thought maybe would be, fought for his people, stood up. It was, I'll read what it says there. It's from a hymn, a popular hymn at the time. "Hark from the tomb, a mournful sound, mine ears attend the cry. Ye living men, come view the ground where you must shortly lie." Whoa. If you're afraid of graveyards, so he can be visited up there. It would be nice to have a marker or something to indicate who he was and what he tried to do and what he lived through. But I invite any of you to head on up there, where the Scott exit is on 81. If you're heading north, you turn right, at the end of the exit ramp, and it takes you right up to a T, and it's right in front of you. Kept driving right up, it would be right into the cemetery. It's very close. And then Joe Lick Road is off to the left about a mile, and that's where Fogg's property was. So I don't know if this pains you, but it's depressing stuff, this whole story, but it's in our history, and we can't, shouldn't try to deny it. Hopefully we've learned and grown. So that was kind of the stony soil that the fugitive slaves came across as they headed up here, whether they knew it immediately or not. But the Democrats remained in power, in Luzerne County and in Waverly until the 1880s. But you know, the runaways weren't seeking voting rights at first. They wanted safety and they wanted to start a new life. They kind of kept their heads down, as I'll explain a little bit. So that's half of what I want to talk about. I read from my notes a fair amount because these are quotes I want to be sure I got right. But I want to walk you through now what happened in Waverly and the experience with the fugitives and then into the Civil War. So 1840s is when the first are believed to have come through and decided to actually stay. You can maybe not make it out there, but I don't have a, do I have a clicker on this? No, I mean a laser, I don't. Okay, so this is heading right up from the notch, you know, heading down below Chinchilla, coming to Scranton, you come up. This is the Abington Road that goes up through Clark's Green and up to Waverly and up to Fleetville. This is Waverly. This is the, what I thought it was Lackawanna Trail, I guess you still call it Lackawanna Trail, going through Clark Summit, Dalton, LaPlume, Factoryville. It would come up either of those two roads that have been opened. This was called the Philadelphia Great Bend Turnpike, the one that goes right through Waverly, opened in 1821. And then this, later in the 1820s, was this Factoryville Turnpike that went up. And the fugitives would have followed roads like that, obviously not walk down the middle, but you know, that would have been a route that they would have come along. And there's a story told about the first of the fugitives, a man named George Keyes, the first to stay, being safeguarded in a chimney of a house in LaPlume that was occupied by a farmer named Rodman Sisson, S-I-S-S-O-N, and one of the early settler families here. And then they took him over to Waverly to safeguard him in Waverly, where his daughter lived. And then he decided to stay, and it must have gotten the word out, and more came, and more came. And like I said, by the Civil War time, there were somewhere 60, 70. It depends on how you define it, how far out you go. This picture on the right is an old drawing of Waverly that shows the settlement that is along Carbondale Road, if you know where that might be. It goes from Waverly over toward Carbondale. And if you go down the main drag in Waverly, head north, there's two churches. You go up that road, that's Carbondale. Go up the road, crests about, 150 yards up, rise up, and then you're at the top of the hill. That is where the settlement was centered. It had various names. I use one of the names in the book, Colored Hill, which is a period name that it had, among other kind of uglier, dicier names that locals gave it. And it would have been right here. This is the church building. These are the homes they had over here as well. And so they were helped by some of the whites who stepped forward not only to protect them and feed them as they came through, but then as some decided to stay, actually stepped forward to offer them lessons in reading and writing to the kids and to the adults. You know, slaves are not allowed to learn to read and write. It was illegal in the South. So this would have been miraculous for them to be welcomed, and these lessons offered to them. But it apparently happened, and it happened in that building on the left, which is still on the main drag in Waverly, the old schoolhouse. It's been in the news a bit because of efforts to preserve it. It was where they got their first reading and writing lessons. It also was when enough of them were here and wanted to start their own church. They had their first meetings there, their first services there. Before that happened, George Keyes and another of the fugitives who stayed were actually taken into the white Methodist church in Waverly, which was remarkable too. And then when they later wanted to have their own church, they sent him away with their blessings, and I think material support is indicated in the records as well to help them get going. So, things were moving well for them into the 1850s even with the Fugitive Slave Act. There were episodes, it looks like, of slave catchers coming, but being driven off. And I chronicle a few of them in the book. Important story about that picture on the right. That is the store of Andrew Bedford, who, remember I mentioned, it was the fellow with that resolution about black voting rights. And he actually was the county leader of the Democracy, the Democratic Party, for a period. And so he was a partner at owning that store with another fellow named Leonard Batchelor, who was one of the main abolitionists and Underground Railroad allies. So somehow the two polar opposites were not only coexisting and not, at each other's throats, they actually were business partners. They were partners in other ways too. I was finding in the record they were instrumental in getting a temperance hotel started in Waverly. There was a big movement back then about temperance. Yeah, it lasted a few years till I guess they didn't get enough business. But he was. They were partners in that. They were partners in the Madison Academy. There was a educational academy in Waverly, in the Cemetery Association as well. So how did that happen? It's something that I wrestle with in the book. How could those two things have happened? Logically, you might think, black people living here, Bedford would have called in the dogs, literally, on them. It did not happen. There are no accounts of anybody hounding, residents hounding the black people, nobody trying to burn down the church, anything like that. I surmise, and it's the best I can do is surmise, that a big reason for that might have been religion, might have been scriptural commands. This is one that you read about if you read Underground Railroad and abolition histories out of the book of Deuteronomy. Let me read it to you in case you can't read it clearly from back there. Thou shalt not deliver unto his master the servant which hath escaped unto thee. He shall dwell with thee, even among you, in that place where he shall choose, in one of thy gates where it liketh him best. Thou shalt not oppress him. Very clear declarative command, really, from Scripture. Bedford went to the Methodist Church, the activist Methodist. It was activist at the time on this issue. He would have heard from Batchelor, who was a Presbyterian but also a pious man, I'm sure, about if you consider yourself a Christian, you have a duty to welcome the stranger, hospitality. Do not oppress him. You must not turn him away. And this is explicitly, in this case, about servants, which you could say is slaves. So, there were three parts to the issue about black rights and race relations then. One was the Underground Railroad, and if you were a white person, where were you going to stand on that? Were you going to get involved or not? Also was the issue of abolition. Were you going to stand up and make noise and perhaps risk the country because you felt like slavery was intolerable and an abomination? That was a second and somewhat separate issue. And the third was black people among you and black rights, like black voting rights, like free blacks, regardless of the slavery issue. Just how did you feel about black people, blacks as neighbors? And again, blacks as fellow citizens or not. You can pull them apart. So they effectively could say to someone like Andrew Bedford, you're helping this person who came to you. You did not free him from the South. You can still oppose abolitionism, but this is a person who is in need, who has come to you, and you can see you have a right to do that if you're following God's word. That may have been how you can make sense of these two apparently polar opposites coexisting in their relationship, but also in general in the town, which was, like I say, a majority Democratic town, and could, also, if you were cynical, you could just figure, well, these folks will be farmhands for me, and laundresses, and, I can pay them as little as I want, and they're grateful. And, there probably was some cynicism involved as well, but you could feel if you were a pious, person, they could work on somebody like Andrew Bedford to be helpful. Plus, he was a doctor, and he had a Hippocratic oath. Maybe he felt like it was his duty also to be involved, and he would have seen them up close through that doctoring if he indeed did that with him. Darned, I wish I could find a diary or a journal from him, by him. Doesn't exist, so I'm left having to kind of try to puzzle it out. But that's plausible to me, that may have been how to make sense of this crazy, paradox. So they managed to thrive, or at least do pretty well in the black community in Waverly, and it may be through that. So then we get up through the 1850s into the 1860s, and we have the Civil War breakout. And we had this area that was full of these Democrats who were willing to hold hands with the South and, not stir up the national institutions, meaning, the institution of slavery. And then when the war came, that democracy, that Democratic bloc split into one that became, they're called Peace Democrats, which may sound like, oh, I want to be a peace Democrat. No, that meant appeasing the South. You did not want to go to war over this issue. You were willing to accommodate the South and make peace. Or the War Democrats, who were willing to ally with Lincoln and the Republicans to put down the rebellion and bring the Union back together. So interesting that was what happened with the Democrats. And by the way, I think that Andrew Bedford became a war Democrat because I read about a large rally held in Waverly at what was called the Northern Luzerne Fair. The Abington area and that whole part of Luzerne County was called Northern Luzerne. They had an agricultural fair, and at it they had some speakers. One of them was this orator, a senator from New York, an orator, who Bedford put up, housed in his mansion in Waverly. He wouldn't have done that, I think, if he was a peace Democrat, because this orator was, denouncing the secessionists. So that may have been, how they worked on Bedford, and he moderated himself a bit that way. So I don't know if you knew it. I did not, launching into this, that when the war broke out, black people were not allowed in uniform. Try as they might. They were considered, on the one hand, too dangerous, on the other hand, too afraid, too cowardly. This weird package of racist beliefs about black people. So they were not allowed. Waverly and this whole area had a lot of folks lining up to serve. There also was a population that fought the draft, fought the war, hid, deserters in this area. You find, I have it in the book, they're both here. It was kind of shocking to realize the draft riots happening around here and bitter resistance, but also, on the other hand, a number of them sick of that and signing up to fight, and a number of them died in combat. Only in 1863, after Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, were black people finally allowed in uniform. And by the end of the war, 180,000 black people were in uniform. The number goes up even closer to 200,000, apparently, if you add in all the sailors. Most of them came from the South, actually, but Pennsylvania had a lot of them as well. So here I tick off the ones from Waverly and what units they served in. And this picture, I want to talk about it for a minute. It's a recruitment poster. The Union League in Philadelphia commissioned, and it was distributed north and south to get black men to step forward and enlist once it was permitted. And by the way, the largest black boot camp was right outside Philadelphia in Elkins Park, a place called Camp William Penn. And a bunch of the Waverly men went there. So this poster shows a man who I think of as like a Moses figure saying, "Come, I will lead. We together will lead our people to something like a promised land." That on the right you see In the bottom right is a cluster of slaves in rags and in chains being helped and freed by that black soldier. Behind the soldier is black men charging into combat. You see the black man in the very foreground on the right. He's tearing up a Southern flag. And here on the left is sort of like the promised land. A black man in a rocking chair, taking his leisure, reading a newspaper, putting down the plow, being able to have a normal life. His children in decent clothes, going to a public school. This is the promised land, you might say. And so he is, beckoning them to step forward. And sure enough, like I say, thousands of them did. So Waverly had one of the men in the 54th Massachusetts, a very famous regiment that's, a lot has been written, and there was even a movie that featured them. 6 of the men served in the 22nd U.S. Colored Troops. That's what the USCT stands for. And I write a lot about what they went through one by one. They were in a lot of bitter or fierce fighting. And then several were in the 3rd, and then other stray individuals and others. So the 22nd, I devote a chapter to their heroism. It culminated at the Battle of Petersburg in 1864. The North was trying to choke off the Confederate capital by moving up from the south, cutting off their supply lines coming from the south, from Petersburg up. And so they moved up this James River and attacked the Confederate defense lines that were a semicircle around Petersburg. And the 22nd managed to break through the lines several times and capture cannon batteries on several occasions that day. It was a long day of battle from dawn to dusk. They must have been absolutely exhausted and took bloody wounds along the way. That picture at the top shows them capturing one of the cannon batteries. That was at dawn at a place called Baylor's Farm. And at the bottom that's a U.S. postage stamp that the U.S. government put out a postage stamp commemorating the 150th anniversary of Petersburg. And that is a painting that was painted in the late 1890s that's called The Charge of the 22nd. And that was 6 of our Waverly guys were in that charge. They went up and successfully penetrated the Dimmock line, the defense lines. And you can see, I'll read you these quotes because it was considered just a red letter day for the black troops. The gallant style in which the colored troops made the charge, as well as their general conduct throughout the day, elicited the highest commendation. Now be aware, this was being, they were fighting, and this was being witnessed by their fellow Union white troops and being witnessed by newspaper correspondents. So they were, chronicling it in the newspapers. In the thickest of the fighting and under the most trying circumstances, they never flinched. June 15th, quote, was a day long to be remembered by the entire colored race on this continent. It is a day when prejudice died in the entire army of the U.S. of America. So these are the Waverly guys who were in this momentous occasion. Now, prejudice did not die, as we know, but it gave you an idea of the boost that it gave to the black troops and how it did impress their white comrades. So the 22nd fought on. They were in 2 other battles that year in Virginia. Finally, Richmond fell. They were among the first troops to go into Richmond. They went in with Lincoln, who went and toured the Capitol, but they went in even ahead and started putting out the flames. Lincoln was killed a few days later, and Ulysses Grant asked for a representative black regiment or unit to be brought up to represent the black troops in the national funeral procession taking Lincoln's body from the White House to the Capitol. And the 22nd was selected, our regiment, and they were moved up to the very head of that funeral cortege. Didn't know that either. That was lovely to learn that. They came back after the war. Waverly had a GAR post. Many of you probably know a GAR, Grand Army of the Republic. It was an integrated post, which was not a normal thing. In Waverly's was integrated. And there, that picture is showing the Ezra Griffin post, which is the biggest post, I think, in the state, was here in Scranton. It was a very big post. It also was integrated, and the man on the right there is one of the Waverly vets who later moved to Scranton, George Keyes Jr. George's father, this first fugitive, to settle in Waverly, he received a mortal wound at Petersburg and died back in Waverly of his wound. It just festered and overtook him. George lived on until the early 1900s and was a standard bearer for the Ezra Griffin post. There he is on the far right. You can see it says, names the other two men and their ages, and for George just says colored. But hey, that was so common in those days. He was in his mid-50s, by the way, in that picture. So a number of the black residents of Waverly trickled away from Waverly after the war and went to seek more opportunity elsewhere. And Scranton, became one of those places. Others went to New York, Pittsburgh, maybe far west, as settlement was spreading west. But this is two of the Waverly cases. The woman on the right is Mary Jane Merritt, who had come up as a slave, settled in Waverly for a while, apparently went to Canada during the Fugitive Slave Act period, came back, went down to Scranton with her husband, who subsequently died, but he opened a grocery store, or some kind of a store on Wyoming Ave, and she took it over after he died and ran it for years, which was unusual for a black woman to be doing that. You can see that proud portrait of her. She later moved to Wilkes-Barre and raised her family and died down there. Here on the left is Lackawanna Avenue that says up top, G.W. Brown Storage. He was another Waverly man, George Brown, very interesting case. And if somebody wants to do some more research, get in touch with me, because he's worth even more digging. He had a draying business, D-R-A-Y, draying. That was like hauling, storing and hauling. You can see his teams of cars and horses that would haul things around and then would be stored in that warehouse if needed. But there are whites and blacks in his workforce from the looks of that picture. He was raised and educated in Waverly and was an ambitious, enterprising fellow, came down. This was a successful business. It was one of the few that was like acceptable to whites. Yeah, we'll let him have the draying field, but he had a big one of the biggest in the state. It remained in business until well into the car era. I don't know exactly when it was over, maybe 1950s, you see trucks with G.W. Brown on it. And by the way, the university has named a building for the first black graduate here, a man named Lewis Brown Hall. Lewis Brown worked for George Brown in that draying business. So another interesting thing about him, and another one of his enterprises, was there was a newspaper, a black newspaper in Scranton from about 1900 to about 1908 called The Defender, a very outspoken, brave newspaper. And George Brown was one of the investors, who got it going. I was able to find the only existing roll of it. It's at the State Library in Harrisburg. And it gives you about a year and a half of what it reported. And wow, that's something to research more about. He was chronicling, or his editors were chronicling the discrimination, the systematic discrimination against black people in the unions, in the restaurants, in housing. And writing it out in black and white and shaking a fist at it. And also having field correspondents writing in about the comings and goings in dozens of black communities around Pennsylvania, all the way out like Altoona and hither and yon. A remarkable newspaper. So, we're getting to the end of Colored Hill and Waverly, but the second wave, came and made an impact down here in Scranton. So this is a picture of the, on the left, of the little black church on Colored Hill in Waverly after it closed. It closed in the 1920s. It basically, the community aged away. The membership died out or moved away. And it, like I say, it closed, I believe, in 1923, I think, and was sold off, became a series of private homes. And the soldiers, 7 of the soldiers of Waverly's 13 black soldiers are buried up at this lovely cemetery, a country cemetery called Hickory Grove on the edge of Waverly. Some of you maybe been there. Go down row 5 and you'll see a lineup of military headstones, and match them up with the folks who I profile in the book. And there they are. I had no idea they were there. They're right near where my parents are buried too, so it's like they're watching over my dad, who is a history buff, which is kind of a nice feeling. So after it aged out and Colored Hill was no more, it kind of dropped out of the collective memory. But more last 10 years or so, Waverly's taken a new pride, I think, in this history. One of the indications of that is, I guess it was earlier this year. Yeah, it was earlier this year. The community house in Waverly issued this walking map of historic sites in the village that you can go and get at the COM. Here it is, and walk you around. I helped them come up with some of the information about the various sites. You can go see where Rodman Sisson lived when he moved into Waverly. You can see where George Keyes is buried. These are right around the community house, where Batchelor lived, where Bedford lived, and some of the others, and have a blurb about each of them. I invite you to do that if you haven't yet. It's pretty remarkable local history. The Colored Hill settlement was the largest black settlement for 30 miles around in its heyday. Over on the right is something that I was able to put together thanks to this grant from the Willery Foundation, and it's an educational website, a free website with a lot of teacher resources on it. There's me being blocked out. That's a kind of an introductory video, but above it you see a little tab that says for teachers, and that's the core of this website. And along the bottom are about 10, 15-minute learning segments that pull out different themes of the book, designed for classroom use. I invite you to visit it yourself, and if you know any school teachers or schools that might be interested. I've been talking to people at the intermediate unit, that is the umbrella group for 20 high schools around here, to make them aware of it and make myself available if they would like. I'm not going to get rich off this. It's really just to kind of get the word out and increase their understanding of what happened right here, and realize they were in the thick of some pretty dramatic history. So that is the Embattled Freedom page. It's embattledfreedom.org. And again, I invite you to read that. To visit that. How are we doing for time? Yes? Do we have time for Q&A? Okay. I was going to read a little bit here, but let me stop talking, and I'm happy to answer a few questions. And it was mentioned earlier, I'll be over at the Historical Society, happy to say hi, sign a book if you want to get a book. I know there are books for sale back there. I'll stick around for that if you'd like to. Yeah. Hi, Allison. Any quick questions here? Otherwise, we can just break.
Question.
Yes.
Hi.
Hello.
Glennis Johns, also a researcher.
Sure. Yeah. Hi.
Sociologist, archivalist. I'm doing a lot of work archiving the history of Scranton, Pennsylvania.
Terrific.
So we were in email. I was emailing you.
Yes, I remember your name, Glenn.
Okay,
yeah, hi.
Yeah, so your research and the techniques that you use are very similar to the ones that I use. And I really enjoy your approach. But these are more of like comments about what I have to share with everyone. So.
How about standing up?
Okay, sorry. I should have done that. I'm so sorry. But yeah, I just wanted to say a few comments. Like I said, I enjoy your research, and as a Black woman from Scranton, Pennsylvania, and this area, I think as Black people, we kind of have lost our own history, no fault of our own, and so, you know, I like that people are taking initiative to do something. So, this isn't a comment to like damper your research or anything, but I just feel like a lot of times we have like this kind of, when we look at research and chronicling Black history, we kind of have like this white savior aspect to it. And like I see a lot of times the way that you talk about these people, and you're doing them a just favor, but
Which people? You mean the white people?
no, I'm talking about the men that you highlight in your book. Okay, so I'm saying
You mean the soldiers?
yeah, or the fugitives in which you call
The
them.
fugitives, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
So what I wanted to say was that like I said, I admire the work you're doing, and I think we need to start having this dialogue. But I also feel like I don't remember how I really wanted to say this, but like I said, I just felt like this is like something that we need to do. And there's not a lot of times we don't have our own voice, and a lot of times these things are sensationalized. And so I think that we need to actually say like the reality of these folks that were here, you know. So I do believe that when you said that that they were surviving there, I think it was more of like a maintaining. My question was to you, when did the community kind of start to disperse? I know there's about...
When did it start to what?
Disperse.
Mm-hmm.
So you said that the community was there between 1840s until about, what, 1870, 1880s?
Well, the last of them, about 1920s,
When did, like...
when they were pretty old. The few who were left were pretty old by then.
And in your research, why do you think they moved away? Because right now, what is the demographics of Waverly right now? Are you sure?
Well, I think the minorities are South Asians now. I know they're...
Population.
An interesting fact is my house now is actually where Rodman Sisson moved. I didn't mention that, but that was nice to learn that. Is now occupied by a Black family. But I don't know of other Black families in Waverly. If anybody here lives in Waverly, I haven't lived in Waverly for 50 years, so
Okay. No, I was just asking, you did all this work, so I just wanted
Yes.
to know the demographics.
Yeah, it's overwhelmingly white.
Overwhelmingly, okay.
Yeah.
So the last time I checked the demographics, it was less than 1%. So that's totally okay, but I just wanted to know when the community trickled away.
Yeah.
And my hypothesis for this, because I'm speaking as a Black woman to the Black community, and I think that's the problem that we have too. We don't necessarily have our own voice. And like I said, I'm not saying this to combat you. I'm just saying this to add to the dialogue, to your research. That Waverly did have this population here, and a lot of those people that you spoke on did move to Scranton, Pennsylvania, because there was more opportunities there. As you mentioned Colored Hill, the reason that they had a hill is because they weren't integrated into the community. So they had to actually...
They were pretty, no, they were, I mean, they were right next door, and they were living, in some cases, at least in the early years, living on the properties of the white people. Now, maybe they were in the barn and they weren't living upstairs in the bedroom, but they were not, you go off in the woods and we'll send a runner with some food for you. They were right where the town, right on the edge of the town where it was naturally spreading. So I don't think they were, I say in the book that Waverly kind of self-integrated itself. So I don't think they were kept at an arm's length, really.
Because I'm a sociologist, so I look at narratives a lot, particularly, and
Yeah.
the way that we write things and the way that we talk about things is something that's really important, especially in the American fabric and like how we preserve research and history. And so, like, I admire that you have all these quotes because you're showing what people said during that time, and I think that is a way that we can see things. So yeah, and just, I guess this is all I want to say. I'll talk to you on the side. And
Yeah, okay.
I want to open it up for other people.
Yeah, I would love to, dialogue with the other folks and have other people
Absolutely.
broaden the story. And it broke my heart that I wasn't getting Black, journals or local Black voices of the era in there. That was why it was so lovely to find out about the Defender and get, their perspective on it in the moment. That was very powerful, but it only began in 1900. I didn't get it from earlier.
Well,
Yeah.
thank you.
Sure.
Anybody
2 minutes ago. Dr. William Hudson was Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences at the University of Louisville when he died. He was the first African-American ever to have an administrative role at that level, and he was the founder of the Black Studies Department at the university. But anyway, he used to always remind me when I spoke about fugitives or when we were studying that they were, he used to use the phrase, enslaved men and women as opposed to slaves.
Yeah.
That people are humans and their condition is to be enslaved. And that was awkward for me in the beginning, but it's what I've tried to make myself do since Blaine was such a good teacher. That's one thing. But the second thing is, the other thing that used to strike me whenever I learned about my hometown, because I'm from Louisville, from Blaine, is how enormous the history of racism is in our country, and how little most white people see it and know it. You said it yourself, that it was astonishing to you. A student at Harvard one time said to me, there was no history of apartheid in this country. Well, yeah, there was. You know, in my childhood, Black people, white people lived by law in different parts of the country, in different parts of the city. We went to different schools, we had different health care. We were segregated by law. And the conversation about whether Black men and women could be citizens or were barred from citizenship because of their color, not because of the condition of their slavery. But it's clearly a part of our history, but it's always just astounding to me how much most of us don't acknowledge that, see it, or know it.
It's called cultural amnesia, and yeah, it's something we have to reckon with. I mean, that's one of the things I was trying to accomplish with the book, is just get people to face it, you know, to have a full understanding. It's good and bad, our history. So as for the terms, yeah, I mean, I was calling them freedom seekers. I think I was using the terminology you recommended in there, but I called them slaves too, and maybe I should never have done that. I was trying to sort of mix up vary the terminology, but where's Glynis? What do you think? Did you find that offensive to use the word slave?
No, okay, so my perspective on this is that your whole book is based on the fact of these people of color being fugitive slaves. However, I don't think that, the only thing I don't think that you touched on was when they transcend from being a fugitive into a citizen. Because the entire book, you kind of just refer to them all the time as a fugitive, and like I just felt like, like I said, I was looking for that pivot moment where these people of color, these men and women, mainly men that you talked about, when they transcended from being a fugitive into just being a person of color or a citizen. And like I said, you did touch on the humanity of them, and as you talked about before, you did say like these rights didn't happen, but we have to remember, people of color, Black people, were enslaved for more than the years of the emancipation and the Civil War. We're talking 400 years of being in chains and bondage. So then you have to think about when these people get their freedom, and starting from this point, when we've already had a lineage of people that had the right to be humans and have this humanity. And so those are the things that I'm talking about. So it's like, yes, they're coming from freedom, they're coming from bondage, and they're stepping into this place of being a free person, but that also we have to learn how to be free. And when you say that you couldn't find records or like journals, that's right, because a lot of these people could not actually read or write. And a lot of times, like you said, they were trying to survive and maintain. So keeping a diary was not the first thing on their list and plate and agenda of a life. They needed to build something, they needed to start, and they need to do something for the next generation. So, like I said, I think this is a great book, and I think this is a good thing to have. I think it highlights a lot of things, but like I said, your book is something that we just need in the record. We need this in the catalog of knowledge. One other thing I wanted to bring up, though, is you mentioned that people of color, Black people, the first time they were able to fight for the American soil, the American fabric, the military, was in the Civil War.
No, I was saying they weren't allowed to fight during the Civil War, period, until 63. No, I'm not denying they fought in prior wars. During the regime of the military regime in the Civil War, they were not allowing them at first, even though they had fought.
I don't consider that to be all the way the truth. Even in the Confederacy, when there were still people enslaved, they were having, they would use the
Yeah,
slaves
they weren't.
as
Yeah, they weren't arming them.
Yeah, like if you had a son and yourself were being enlisted into the military, you can send your slaves to fight for you for the Confederacy, and that was what was happening. And same thing when the Union, there was people that were on Union soil fighting for the Confederacy that were black, people of color. So on both sides there was free men of color and also men in bondage that were fighting in these wars. Also in the Revolutionary War, they were called the Loyalists, and they fought for the Revolutionary War. So I was confused about your statement when you said that the first time that African Americans or people of color were allowed to be in the military.
In the Union Army.
In the Union Army, which was not true. What was his name? Cryptus Atticus in the Revolutionary War.
Yeah.
What's the Union Army? The Army of the Confederate something or other. The Union Army really didn't become consolidated if you look at
It was like a conglomerate.
Right.
Right.
So it doesn't become the Union Army until we're fighting to save the freedom.
Okay, but it sounded to me like the only time that people of color were allowed to be in the military of any fashion was the Civil War. But if I misunderstood it, then my apologies on that. But I was just saying that across American history, there's been people of color that were fighting for America.
Okay. That's right, and it's something that we don't teach enough and honor enough, yeah.
So I'm actually a black nationalist, if you can't tell. I'm a Black Lives Matter all the way, and I'm not afraid, I'm unapologetic about it. And I think it's about time that here in the city of Scranton, we need to start representing our history and our culture. And I love events like this because, like I said, we need to start talking about and giving representation.
Yeah.
One more question for you, I'm so sorry.
Can we let's talk about it, you and I.
You can talk personally.
May I say that I very much, my name is Don Thompson.
Okay.
I can project my voice very well. Being a teacher all my life. I very much enjoyed your presentation. I certainly learned a number of things that you had to say. So
Thank you.
I do thank you for that. Just a couple of things. Are you aware that there's a family in Scranton, and I know many of you are, named Burgetts?
Yes.
That have a direct connection.
Yeah, I've spoken to Sandra, yeah.
And I know that because I have a cousin who married, into that family. And one of the things, and I don't know if your book covers it, but one of the things that came out of Waverly was a catering business a number of years ago that gave jobs to all kinds of, I think men mostly, in the Scranton area. So there's just a vast amount of knowledge there, and the fact that we're uncovering, parting some of that is just terrific.
Good.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Well, thank you so much, and why don't we have a repast? I will be over at the Historical Society. Thanks for coming, everybody. Good.